Hey, what is up everybody? Platform Disciple here, and today I'm going to review they're not really new anymore, but the cards from the promotional set that feature players or people who have supported the game over the years. Very late on this, but I do want to share my opinions because I think some people were curious to hear what I had to say about some of these, and I do think that they are interesting cards worth talking about. The first card we're going to talk about is Dalton the Blood Hunter. And I want to preface here that the animated versions of these cards that I'm showing on screen are not cards I own. I don't own these, and for that reason, the image I'm showing you is out of date. The cards have been appended with the character types that they have. Dalton is now a human demon, and that demon subtyping is quite relevant. Because there's a lot of cards that synergize with demons. But that being said, I think Dalton is a very simple card, which is not necessarily a bad thing because Dalton is still significantly different than other cards that already exist in the game. So he does have his own niche to fill. But I want to say here, and this is going to come up in some of the redesign discussions or balance discussions that I have repeatedly, which is that 4 health versus 5 health is a really, really big deal in Infinity Wars because there are a lot of things that do 4 damage. And not only are there a lot of things that do 4 damage, but Lightning Blast and Flame Dawn Commando are so good and so ubiquitous, and they are both 1 purity, that any deck that has a single Veror pip or a single Flame Dawn pip is going to have 3 of those cards, which makes any card that has 4 or lower health incredibly vulnerable to those effects. And there are other things that do 4 damage, like Yuanqi's Wrath, but the point I want to make here is that I think that Lightning Blast and Flame Dawn Commando are frankly too good. And I'm not suggesting that those 2 cards should be reworked right now. I think there are tweaks that would help. Like I think Lightning Blast would still be a very good card, even if it could not target the command zone. And I think that forcing somebody to go into double Veror or double Descendants of the Dragons to be able to kill commanders feels more appropriate than any deck that has a single Veror pip being able to blast a card like Dalton or really anything else as early as turn 1 on the game. Similarly, Flame Dawn Commando, the trouble with Flame Dawn Commando is that its fail case is still very good. Its stats allow it to trade reasonably with other 1-drops without even factoring in the deploy effect. And once the deploy effect is in there, it is kind of like the best card in the game. It might not feel like that because he's a tiny little guy, but the amount that Flame Dawn Commando and Lightning Blast affect the viability of other cards in the game is really disproportionate to anything else. That I can look at a card like Dalton, see it has 4 health, and know that it's really going to struggle. And that's not because 4 health is too weak in a vacuum. It's because it's too weak with the context of Lightning Blast and Flame Dawn Commando are cards that exist and will be a 3 of in a huge number of decks. So anyways, that was a really long way to say that I kind of think that Dalton would be a little more of an interesting card if he had 5 health. Would that make him too good? I don't think so. Probably not. And if it did make him too good, I think he could take some sacrifices elsewhere on the card. But it really sucks that so many cards are just dead in the water by virtue of having 4 or less health. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about and forgive me if this is not how you would like this pronounced, but Benionin, Mage Guild Archivist. And somebody can correct me, spell out phonetically how you would say Benionin, but that's what I am going to be saying for now. I would categorize this card as being a reasonably good design for the game because it is fun enough to play, at least for somebody, and unlikely to have a significant amount of disruption to how the game is played more competitively. So Benionin lets you draft ability cards similar to how Medi can draft cards, which is both what is exciting about the card, but for me, what is underwhelming about the card is how easy it is compared to Medi. If I am going to play a fun, goofy deck, I would prefer to opt into the full goofiness that comes with Medi, where I get to see every card in the game. Benionin has a more curated draft experience, so if you like having a very ability-focused deck, you can opt in to play Benionin instead of Medi. That might be appealing to somebody. It's not particularly appealing to me, because if I'm going to go goofy, I'd rather go full goofy, and if I'm not going to go goofy, I'm not going to touch Benionin. The other thing that kind of hurts Benionin compared to Medi is that Medi has a reasonably statted body, so he can actually be played onto the board. Medi also doesn't exhaust when you draft him, so he can be on the board and drafting, affecting the board at the same time. Benionin cannot do that. Benionin's stats are bad, exhausts, and then the final thing is that because Benionin's stats are bad and doesn't have that effect that Medi has that just lets him come back to the command zone, Benionin can just get kind of sniped by something like 2 Lightning Blasts. It's coming up again. Or Lightning Blast plus a Yuan-Chi's. Or a Banish. There's like your Benionin is a card that is in the kind of like territory of, I think he's kind of a meme. I don't think he's very good. And it sucks that you can be playing a card that is just goofy and fun and still get just pooped on by these cards that exist at one faction purity that can blow up the command zone. So, if I was going to tweak Benionin, I would give him more health. Maybe even a significant amount more health, because I don't think that it should be so easy to kill him. But again, like I've mentioned before, the number 4 and also multiples of 4 are pretty big, important factors for health in Infinity Wars. Giving Benionin even 1 more health would make him a lot more palatable, because he can't get sniped by some combination of Lightning Blast or Yuan-Chi's Wrath or a single Banish, and I don't think that would do anything in terms of how viable the card is in a competitive sense, because I don't think it is ever viable in a competitive sense. Because you are giving up a faction pip for a factionless card if you're running him in the command zone, and that's a huge price to pay. And then you're also adopting a full set of randomness into the deck that generally is not going to benefit you as much as the consistency of just running a deck that has good cards in it. So that's my 2 cents on Benionin. But I do want to say that I really think that cards that are harmless for the game and are still fun and interesting are good design. Even of this one, I think falls short of exciting me. It's not harmful to the game, and a card not being harmful to the game needs to be applauded, because sometimes there are harmful cards to the game, and we'll get to Bemi in a minute here. But so I do want to actually just applaud Benionin. I think he falls short of the mark, but he's still okay. Next we have Soul Reaper, and Soul Reaper I think is actually very fantastic game design, and I don't think Soul Reaper, I would not prescribe any changes to this card. I think it's interesting, it's unique, it's viable enough to be exciting to try in multiple different types of decks, while not being good enough to overshadow existing cards. And bonus points here is that Soul Reaper falls under the category that I discussed in the previous video of being a slow character, where he deploys from your hand into the support zone, and does not have an immediate effect on the battlefield. Soul Reaper does have a deploy effect, and that deploy effect can be extremely impactful, but it doesn't affect how your opponent needs to order their characters in combat. It's not going to blindside them in that sense, where they think they've made an educated choice on how to order their characters. And it also doesn't have like the problem of being a fast character that adds stats to the assault zone or defense zone in a way that warps the flow of the game. So Soul Reaper, really fantastic design, super cool card. Thumbs up all around on this one. Okay. Next we have Blue Leaf the Scroll Keeper. And Blue Leaf is a top-end card for Descendants of the Dragons and Genesis Industries. And I really think of this card as a win condition, where if you can stick Blue Leaf to the board and have him survive for a turn, or you have to survive as well. So if you can stick Blue Leaf to the board and get to your next turn, the amount of value that you generate off of Blue Leaf should be high enough that you can pull together a win. Barring situations where you're not like you can't be dead. You can't be sitting at 10 health and expect Blue Leaf to dig you out of that hole. But if there was a card that is going to do it, Blue Leaf is kind of high up there. And again, similar to Soul Reaper, this is a card that doesn't tend to impact the battlefield the turn it comes down, but is also exciting and interesting and can be very powerful. It is a payoff for playing a card that doesn't do something right away. Sometimes if you have excess of resource, he can do a little something where you can play Blue Leaf and then immediately recall a lower cost card. But I think that's an okay. Like, it's okay for some cards to do things right away, especially if they're not like massive game warping things. That being said, I haven't really played with Blue Leaf because the combination of Descendants of the Dragons and Genesis Industries doesn't really match my playstyle. It's kind of a spell slingy buff your characters sort of deck, which that's just how it is for the time being. And that doesn't appeal to me, but it appeals to some people, and I've seen Blue Leaf get played, and I do think that it's a cool card design. Okay, so the final card we're going to talk about, and this has been nerfed, is Bemi, Paragon of the Community. And Bemi is going to let me talk about, we'll talk about original Bemi and why original Bemi was a problem. And then I will talk about the nerfed Bemi. I think nerfed Bemi is far more reasonable, but I do think it's dangerous design space, especially when you look at like the previous version. Being a card that did exist at one point in time means that someone, frankly, was not in alignment with how Infinity Wars is typically played and how the previous version would have impacted the game, because I think most people would have seen that as kind of an issue without even having played it much. So let me first say what I like about Bemi. What I like about Bemi is that Bemi encourages you to play a lot of one-cost characters that otherwise don't see a lot of play right now, because the payoff for playing one-cost characters with Bemi is so enormous that you can justify playing cards that are not so great to reap that payoff. The original version of Bemi did not require you to pay any resources. So you could be putting an extra +4/+4 out every turn, as provided that you had a one-cost character that you hadn't already used it on to receive that effect. So there's a number of things going on here that make this problematic. Some of the small ones are that the way unique characters work in Infinity Wars made it very easy to not really care about the effect that Bemi... Like, Bemi is supposed to be limited by the fact that you can't run an entire gauntlet of unique characters. But the reality is that you could use tokens and buff those, or you just gain such a huge advantage from having this go off like even just twice that you're okay having your second Flamed On Commando sit in your hand to do nothing, because your first Flamed On Commando has the stats of a 3-drop, and you paid 1 resource on him. So that leads into kind of the other problem, which is, I mentioned Flamed On Commando, is that Bemi, although Bemi made some less viable 1-cost characters get to take the spotlight for a bit, the real problem is that Bemi takes the good 1-cost characters and make them better. And I think, generally speaking, a lot of 1-cost characters in the game are disproportionately more viable than their expensive counterparts, because establishing control of the board early is so important, and relative to their cost to stat ratio, or like cost to impact ratio, lower cost characters tend to be better, and a lot of decks just tend to be running a lot of them anyways. So the trouble was that Bemi let you play stuff that was already good and make it way, way better. And when it cost 0 resources to activate Bemi, +4/+4 is basically you're getting a free 1-drop glued to your other 1-drop. And in most cases, even with the most like innocuous 1-drops, like if we take a look at like Flamed On Footman or something, who I'm gonna just quickly pull up here. This card becomes a 1-cost 9/8, which puts it on par with 3-cost characters, and you are paying 1 resource for him. And this is the benign example. This is a card that is frankly underplayed because it's not good, and with Bemi it becomes the best 1-drop in the game by a serious margin. And then when you put that buff on a card that is like already good, like like let's say support drone, like oh my goodness, it's crazy. Okay. And the final thing I want to say is that if there was ever a justification for Bemi being good, the justification was it gets hosed by No More Heroes. And there's another one coming here, but I don't think you want matches to be coin flippy based off of, is your opponent in the faction that runs No More Heroes, and did they draw their No More Heroes? And if they did, they just automatically win the game, more or less. That's not a good experience, because it takes away the value of playing strategically and puts the game outcome more on, did the opponent have the No More Heroes or not, which is not a rewarding experience for either player, regardless of who wins and regardless of whether No More Heroes are involved or not. You can't have the game be balanced entirely on the shoulders of cards like No More Heroes. And that's been recognized. Bemi has been nerfed, but I do want to continue this rant here because the kind of mistake that Bemi was so egregious that it shouldn't ever happen. The other way that you may have been able to justify to yourself that Bemi might be okay is that Bemi has 8 health. It comes up again. Bemi is one of many commander cards that is vulnerable to Lightning Blast, Yuan-Chi's Rash, and Banish because of that multiples of 4 thing. And you may have been able to say to yourself, well, you can just turn off Bemi on, one of the earlier turns of the game. I do not think that having extremely pushed command options can ever be justified by saying there are cards that turn off the command zone, like Humble, multiple Lightning Blast, multiple Yuan-Chi's Wrath, and Banish. That creates the design trap of permitting sloppy and bad game design like Bemi on the justification of, oh, well, players will adapt and include more of these cards. But part of the problem is that Lightning Blast, Yuan-Shi's Wrath, and Banish are already like ubiquitous and in a huge swath of decks. And you either have cards like Dalton or Benionin, whose viability is completely crushed by the existence of cards like Banish and Lightning Blast, or you have a card like Bemi that is so pushed that it doesn't care about the cards like Lightning Blast and such. And that's not a great spot to be in as a player or as a game designer, where so much of the game revolves around that. Okay, but let's talk about Bemi post-nerf. The card's actually quite reasonable now. I think it's still very good, but it's not game warping to the point where if I was going to show up to a tournament while Bemi was at his most broken, I would either be playing No More Heroes or playing Bemi, or both. And No More Heroes, I think, if a huge number of players are feeling pressured to run 3 No More Heroes in their deck, that's a really bad sign. Especially if you can point to one card, being Bemi, as the source of that problem. The new version of Bemi is, I think, good enough to bring to a tournament, but unlikely to necessarily win, because No More Heroes is still a good enough card to carry in the main deck or sideboard, even if it's not constantly everywhere. But I would say that in general, I do not want to see cards that increase the significance of the earlier half of the game beyond how significant it already is. The first 3 turns of Infinity Wars can make or break a match, and a card like Bemi front loads that pressure even more. And when you have that much pressure front loaded into the outcomes of your typical game, it means that your aggro decks get more aggressive and your control decks get more turtly, and it leaves this huge gap in between for, like, what about the dude who just wants to play like a 4-drop that doesn't immediately kill your opponent? Like, what about the person who wants to play like even a card as classic as Splitter Robot in the kind of meta that that Bemi fosters? A card like Splitter Robot starts to look too slow unless it's in the command zone for an aggressive deck, and the control deck is just not gonna consider it, because, like, why would they run a character in the middle of their curve when they could run more removal to try to just absolutely crush the aggro deck before they eventually stabilize and deploy their win condition? So yeah, Bemi, not a fan of that type of game design. I do think that the current version of Bemi is fine. I would prefer if cards like that don't exist. But I am playing Bemi, and I will admit that Bemi is fun to play, and the current version of him doesn't feel broken. It's more in line with where it ought to be, but again, I think that cards that aim to front load the game, because that's what Bemi's value is that he puts a bigger emphasis on the early half of the game. I think those cards tend to be less healthy for the game. Even though the current version of Bemi is far more reasonable, and I do want to applaud and thank the game designers and developers for having a quick turnaround on Bemi, where I think most of the community was pretty. It's pretty apparent that Bemi needed to be changed, and that feedback got heard and implemented quickly. I don't think a mistake like Bemi should happen, but if they do happen, the way it was handled was probably the best way it could be handled, in terms of just the quick turnaround on listening to the feedback. Okay, so that wraps up my review of these cards. I'm going to also do a deck featuring Bemi in the near future, because you guys haven't seen gameplay from me or a deck tech in forever, because my content has become more just kind of talking at you about the game, and I'd like to spare you from that sometime and maybe have some fun playing some games. So until then, take it easy.